Welcome back to a study in the book of Genesis. We're looking at Genesis chapter 27, the conspiracy of Isaac. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "A little lie is like a little pregnancy." How aptly that statement summarizes the events of Genesis chapter 27. Isaac, with the cooperation of Esau, conspires to thwart the purposes of God to fulfill his covenant with Abraham through Jacob. Rebekah, aided by her son Jacob, seeks to outwit and outmaneuver Isaac and Esau to maintain for Jacob the right of the firstborn which he purchased from Esau. The secular songwriter has caught the spirit of some Christian service, and surely the heartbeat of this chapter in the song entitled "Working Like the Devil, Serving the Lord." It's difficult to see who surpasses the rest in this web of scheming and deceit: Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, or Esau. This makes all four participants in the present scene almost equally at fault. Isaac, whether he knew of the sale or not, knew God's birth oracle in 25:23, yet he set himself to use God's power to thwart it in 27:29. This is the outlook of magic, not religion. Esau, in agreeing to the plan, broke his own oath of 25:33. Rebekah and Jacob, with a just cause, made no approach to God or man, no gesture of faith or love, and reaped the appropriate fruit of hatred, Kindred says. The family unit had been split into two factions, each headed by a parent who wants to live out their own expectations through a son at the expense of the others. It's indeed a tragic story, and yet one that rings true to life and reveals much of what we are like today. When Isaac was old, he called Esau to bless him. Isaac told Esau to go hunt game and prepare it for him to eat. Isaac said after he'd eaten, he would give Esau his blessing. Verse 1 says, "When Isaac was old and almost blind, he called for Esau, his oldest son, and said, 'My son?' 'Yes, father,' Esau replied. 'I'm an old man now,' Isaac said. 'I expect every day to be my last. Take your bow and a quiver full of arrows out into the open country and hunt some wild game for me. Prepare it just the way I like it, so it's savoury and good, and bring it here for me to eat. Then I'll pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die.'" There are several overriding themes which are interwoven in these four verses. These themes characterize the attempt of Isaac and Esau to regain the blessing of God, as promised to Abraham, spoken to Isaac, and unscrupulously secured by Jacob. Recognition of these themes will enable us to grasp the significance of this turning point in the lives of these four members of the patriarchal family. The first theme is that of urgency. There's an obvious haste in what takes place. Our impression is that Isaac stands with one proverbial foot in the grave and the other on a banana skin. He's old. Perhaps he thinks he's dying, and the blessing must quickly be pronounced upon Esau before it's too late. On the surface, this urgency seems to be well founded. Isaac is old, perhaps 137 years old if the calculations are accurate. Our figures, after consideration of Genesis 47:9 and 45 and 41 and 29, calculates that Jacob would have been 77 years old when he left for Paddan Aram. If this is correct, Isaac would be 137 years old here, since we know he was 60 years old when the twins were born. Stigger's a commentary on Genesis. It comes as no surprise that Isaac suffers from some of the infirmities of old age, such as poor eyesight. Isaac was far from death's door, however, for we learn from Genesis 35 that it was more than 40 years later before he died at the ripe old age of 180. We should point out that his half-brother Ishmael did die at the age of 137. Perhaps Isaac was not wrong to consider his days were numbered, but in his desire to see his favourite son receive the Abrahamic blessings, he stooped to some unspiritual actions. From excavations at Nuzu in central Mesopotamia, we learn that the oral blessing, or will, had a legal validity and would stand up even in the courts. Nuzu tablet P56 mentions a lawsuit between three brothers in which two of them contested the right of a third to marry a certain Zolusharita. The young man won his case by arguing that this marriage was provided for in his father's deathbed blessing. The second impression we have of verses 1 to 4 is that of secrecy. Normally the blessing would have been given before the entire family, because it was in reality an oral will which legally determined the disposition of all that the father possessed. Distribution of the family wealth and headship would best be secured and carried out in the presence of all who are concerned. Thus we later find Jacob giving his blessing at the presence of all of his sons in Genesis 49. No such atmosphere is to be sensed in the conversation between Isaac and Esau. Neither Jacob nor Rebekah were present, and this was hardly an oversight. Had it not been for the attentive ear of Rebekah, the entire matter would seemingly have been completed with only two parties involved. The third impression, which can hardly be missed, is that of conspiracy. This follows closely on the heels of the secrecy already described. Conspiracy and secrecy go hand in hand. There can be little doubt that Isaac intended that this clandestine feast to convey his blessing upon Esau to the exclusion of Jacob altogether. This is why Isaac had no blessings left to confer upon Esau. Here was a premeditated plot to thwart the plan and purpose of God for Jacob. It's inconceivable that Isaac was ignorant of the revelation of God to Rebekah. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 people shall be separate from your body, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. Genesis 25 it said. Can you really imagine in this ongoing contest between Rebekah and Isaac that she would not appeal to this revelation from God as the biblical basis for the favoritism shown towards her son Jacob? Then again, can you imagine that Isaac was ignorant of the sale of Esau's birthright to his brother? Isaac was not being informed for the first time of this when Esau cried out in despair, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? He has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." The final and compelling evidence of Esau's disqualification for spiritual headship in his marriage to 2 Canaanite wives. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Bighli the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. Totally disdaining spiritual purity, Esau didn't hesitate to intermarry with the Canaanites. God's purposes for his people would never be achieved through a person with an attitude like this. In spite of all these elements, Isaac sought to overrule the verdict of God that the elder shall serve the younger. He anticipated doing so by a magical misuse of the pronouncement of the blessing before his death. Normally the birthright belonged to the eldest son. This entitled him to a double share of the property, in addition to the privilege of assuming the father's position of headship in the family. For the descendants of Abraham, it determined the one through whom the covenant blessings would be given. The birthright was more than a title to the family inheritance. It involved a spiritual position. The place of the individual in the covenant status of Israel was part of the birthright. It was this aspect which made the foolishness of Esau so profound, W. White Jr. says. Under certain circumstances, the possessor of this birthright could be dispossessed. Such a change would normally be formalized at the giving of the oral blessing at the time of approaching death. Thus, Jacob gave Ephraim precedence over Manasseh. Jacob also gave Reuben's rights of the firstborn to Judah because of his misuse of his position. And so it appeared that Isaac intended to manipulate God by reversing the decree of God and the rightful ownership of the rights of the firstborn as purchased, although unethically, by Jacob. This he planned to do by giving his oral blessing to Esau. May people serve you, nations bow down to you, be master of your brothers, may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. Either by a genuine or contrived sense of urgency, Isaac sought to secretly overthrow God's revealed will and Jacob's rightful possession by clandestine and conveyance of an oral blessing. By his willful participation, Esau disregarded the legal agreement he had made with his brother. In both instances, a dinner provided occasion for such deception. To sit at the table of Abraham and even Lot was to be given hospitality and protection. To sit at the table of Isaac and his sons was to face the dangers of deception and false dealing. Let's talk about Jacob, the Prince of God. Who was Jacob? His father was Isaac and mother Rebekah. What is the meaning of his name? Jacob, supplanter, heel grabber, later called Israel, Prince with God. The place of birth, Canaan, Padan and Egypt. Occupation, shepherd. The story so far: Jacob bargained for Esau's birthright, the birthright granted, superior rank in the family, a double portion of the paternal inheritance. Deceives Isaac and obtains the blessing of the firstborn. Jacob and Canaan, the defilement of Dinah, the devotion of Bethel, the death of Rachel and Isaac, the Jacob named Israel, and the history of Esau. What about his line? Jacob gains Esau's blessing. Jacob's life at Haran, Jacob's dream and God's promise in Genesis 28, Jacob's labour and his 12 sons, Genesis 29, and Jacob's flight. Jacob's return to Canaan, Jacob wrestles with the angel, Jacob makes peace with Esau. Rebekah told Jacob to get 2 kid goats and she would prepare for them Isaac. So Rebekah plans to outdeceive the situation that she's up against. Rebekah dresses Jacob in Esau's clothes before Esau gets back. She puts goat skins on Jacob's hands and on his neck. Jacob took the food into his father and pretended to be Esau. So both are culpable in this situation. When Rebekah overheard the conversation, so when Esau left for the field to hunt for venison, she called his son Jacob and told him what his father had said to his brother. Do exactly as I tell you. Go out to the flocks, bring me 2 young goats. I'll prepare your father's favourite dish for them. Then take it to your father, and after he has enjoyed it, he will bless you before his death instead of Esau. Jesus once said to his disciples, all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. There's perhaps no clearer illustration of this principle than what can be seen in Genesis 27. Isaac sought to further his own interests by means of cunning and deceit. God's method of dealing with this was to give Isaac a wife who was far more skillful at manipulation than he. What a master of deceit this woman was. Rebekah could easily have met the job requirements for a position with the MI5. She served as a counter spy in the service of her son. She posed as a faithful, loving wife, but under all of this, she sought to further Jacob's interests at the expense of her husband Isaac. Rebekah, not Jacob, was the mastermind behind the mission impossible of outwitting Isaac and obtaining a blessing for Jacob. Rebekah didn't just happen to overhear the whisperings of Isaac and Esau as they plotted the diversion of divine promises to the eldest son. The text tells us she was listening. The Hebrew form that is used in the original text suggests this was a habit, a pattern of behaviour, not an accident. Esau had hardly gotten outside the house before Rebekah had the wheels in motion to overthrow this conspiracy with a bigger one of her own. When he stopped to think about it, the plan was an incredible one. Only with a sense of desperation or a very devious mind, or perhaps both, could hope such a plot would succeed. How could a son with a totally different disposition and physical appearance possibly manage to convince his father that he was the older brother? The protests of Jacob are all of particular interest. What constitutes the basis for his objections? Moses recorded them for us. Jacob answered his mother Rebekah, behold, Esau my brother is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, then I shall be as a deceiver in his sight, and I shall bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. There is the utter absence of any moral considerations here. Jacob's objections are based upon 2 considerations, both of which deal with pragmatics rather than principle. The first is simply that such a scheme is too incredible to possibly work. Jacob's best reason for avoiding Rebekah's scheme was it was likely to fail. But Rebekah was too shrewd to propose a scheme that she hadn't worked out to the smallest detail. The second objection was based upon a consideration of what would happen if the plot failed. In other words, Jacob was concerned about the consequences of failure. Godly men ought to make decisions based first and foremost upon principle, while ungodly act only on the basis of practicality. We say that crime doesn't pay, but the criminal knows full well that it does, and so the crime rate continues to spiral upwards. The law and the government which enforce it serve as the only deterrent to evil, for penalty counts far more than principle to those who are evil. Rebekah had a ready answer for this objection. She promised to take the blame personally if anything were to go wrong. And we know that she did suffer greatly for the part she played in this scheme. What neither Rebekah nor her son considered, however, were the consequences for their sin, even if they did succeed, which they did. Their plan went off without a hitch, but the results were the opposite of what they had hoped for. One question remains: what should Rebekah have done in these circumstances? Isaac was wrong in what he conspired to do. Jacob was the son whom God chose to be the heir of promise. Nevertheless, evil must not be resisted with evil. It must be overcome by good. The first thing Rebekah should have done was to speak honestly and forthrightly to her husband about this contemplated sin. Submission to authority never includes a silence towards evil. We are to speak the truth in love, even to those in authority over us. Having fulfilled her responsibility to warn her husband of the consequences of the evil he had planned, Rebekah should have been content to leave the matter to God, who is all-powerful and all-wise. Her actions betrayed her lack of faith in the sovereignty of God. She should have acted as Gideon's father did when the people planned to put his son to death for tearing down the altar of Baal. The text says, will you contend for Baal or will you deliver him? If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar. If God is God, then let him act on his own behalf, particularly in those times when we are unable to act in a way that is consistent with his word. Adolf Hitler believed in using the big lie. Little misrepresentations and lies might arouse suspicion, but the big lie would be so incredible that people would assume it must be true. If it was Mark Twain who said that fiction was believable, non-fiction was beyond belief. When Jacob posed his elder brother, it's nothing less than an ancient application of the principle of the big lie. Perhaps Jacob never intended this lie to become as big as it did, but nevertheless it grew bigger and bigger with every statement he made. It began with the words, I am Esau, your firstborn. From this, lie began to be piled upon lie. I have done as you told me. Eat of my game. In response to Isaac's penetrating question, are you really my son Esau? Jacob replied, I am. However, the lie that is greatest is found in verse 20. Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have been so quickly, my son? He said, because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me. Don't you expect a bolt of lightning to come from on high with that one whap? Remove this deceiver once for all. Well, before we come down too quickly on Jacob, think of how many who claim to be Christians today do precisely the same thing. Jacob excused his sin by claiming that God was his partner in his performance. We can hear on the God channel, the Lord led me to do it, when often it's something they've always wanted to do, and they have finally worked up the courage or the folly to go ahead with it. The Lord told me to is that excuse. The Lord has blessed us. Be careful when you hear such statements. There may be evidence of the same kind of thinking that caused Jacob to tell his father God had prospered him by giving him a goat rather than wild game. With what pious words we may seek to conceal our sin. There is something strangely pathetic about Isaac in this chapter. He seems destined to fail, as one would any man attempting to overrule God. His vulnerability is a result of several forces. First of all, Isaac is a victim of old age. His eyes are dim, so that he cannot distinguish between what is genuine and what is artificial. His senses are dulled by age as well, or so it would seem. He didn't see the difference between goat and game. He couldn't differentiate between goat skin and that of his son Esau. Then too, Isaac's judgment seems to have been impaired by his haste. It was obvious Isaac wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. He wanted the blessing to go to Esau, so it could be done, could be finished. Had there not been this sense of haste, Isaac might have insisted that his other son be present for the blessing too. Good judgment now, as then, is suspended in the name of urgency. The fact can't be overlooked that the decision Isaac reached was one based upon all 5 of his senses: sight, sound, touch, taste and smell. The only one missing is common sense. The garments which Rebekah had on hand were those of Esau, and they smelled like him too. Some have politely suggested it smells more like cologne. It was not the smell of Esau's deodorant, the smell resulting from the lack of it, that gave him away. Even the dulled sense of Isaac couldn't miss the smell of his son. Imagine it. Isaac, in the final analysis, was led by his nose. Isaac's error is informative in the light of our scientific age that insists upon making decisions solely based on empirical evidence. We cannot see it, hear it, feel it or smell it, then it doesn't exist. A man whose heart is at enmity with God can look at the empirical facts and come up with a conclusion that is totally false. The problem is not with the facts. The problem is with the man, whose head and heart lead him astray. Such was the case with Isaac, and so it is today. The Bible is a wonderful book in that what is true can also be beautiful. While the scriptures are given to edify, to exhort us, this is done by literature which is skillfully written. There's a distinct sense of drama in this narrative. It is so familiar to most of us that we fail to sense it, but it's there nonetheless. We are kept in suspense till the very last moment to see if Jacob can survive the interrogation and inspection of his father. The blessing is not pronounced until last, causing us to fear that at any moment Esau will barge into the room, expose the fraud of his brother, bring a curse upon him while he receives the blessing for himself. Moses tells us that Jacob had just left when his brother came to his father with his meal. Esau must have arrived at his father's bedside with an expectant look, sensing that the blessing was almost in his grasp. What a smug sense of satisfaction and revenge Esau must have been flirting with. At long last, Isaac must have thought he had outwitted his wife and had blessed Esau. All of this was shattered when Esau, approaching his father with the words, "Let my father rise and eat of his son's game that you may bless me." How puzzled Esau must have been at the terrified look in his father's eyes and the way he trembled violently upon his bed. What could possibly have gone wrong? "Oh, my father, bless me too," he begged. But Isaac said, "Your brother was here. He tricked me. He has carried away your blessing." Esau said bitterly, "No wonder his name is Jacob. He has deceived me twice. First taking my birthright and now stealing my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved even one blessing for me?" Isaac said to Esau, "I have made Jacob your master. I have declared that all his brothers will be his servants. I have guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine. What is there left to give?" Esau pleaded, "Not one blessing left for me? Oh, my father, bless me too." And Esau broke down and wept. His father Isaac said to him, "You will live off the land and what it yields. You will live by your sword. You will serve your brother for a time, but then you'll shake loose from him and be free." A sense of dread must have slowly fallen over Esau as it became more and more clear that his brother once again got the best of him. The irony of it all was that since Isaac had tried to give everything to Esau, there was nothing left that could be considered a blessing to his favourite son, for all had been given to Jacob. The consequences of Rebekah and Jacob are recorded in 27, but the tragic results of the conspiracy of Isaac and Esau are seen sooner. Isaac had sought to give all to his favourite son, Esau, at Jacob's expense. Instead, he gave all to Jacob at Esau's expense. Isaac set his heart on that which was contrary to the revealed will of God. Because of this, his world came crashing down upon him when God's purposes prevailed. Esau despised spiritual things and thus sold his destiny for a dinner. Then he attempted to get it back by renouncing his solemn oath and conspiring with his father to dishonestly regain what he had lost through his own profanity. Esau learned that there comes a point of no return in every man's life when regret can bring a reversal of past decisions. All who have rejected Christ as Saviour will live in eternal regret and remorse. This will not overturn the consequences of living with a decision to live in independence from God. For Rebekah and her son Jacob, the price tag for their success was as costly as that of Isaac and Esau for their defeat. I have never seen anyone come away from the end results of sin with a smile in their face. Sin doesn't pay in the end. Jacob and Rebekah can tearfully testify to this fact. Rebekah loved Jacob more than life itself, and seemingly more than Isaac. She sought his success, which happened, to correspond with the revealed will of God, at any price, even deception and deceit. The price she paid was separation from her son, which appears to have lasted for the rest of her life. So far as we can detect, once Jacob left for Haran, he never saw his mother again. Rebekah underestimated the consequences of her sin, for she thought that Jacob would only be gone for a short time, until the death of Isaac. But Isaac lived for a good 40 years until he died at the age of 180. Jacob faced the inevitable consequences, the results of his sin. He must have felt an alienation from his father, whom he had not only deceived but also mocked. He now had a brother who despised him and who looked for the day when he could put him to death. And worst of all, he had to leave the mother he loved. In addition to this, all that he had gained in a material way he was unable to enjoy, because he had to leave it behind to flee for his life. So we see ultimately, sin does not pay. Several doctrines are illustrated by this chapter and should be highlighted. First, we'll learn a bit more about the sovereignty of God. Consistent with other passages of Scripture, we see God ultimately is in control of his universe. Even when men attempt to overrule his decrees, God will always find a way of making his plans come to fruition. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Many are the plans in man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. For the wrath of God, the wrath of man shall praise thee. From this passage in Genesis, a principle can be formulated concerning the sovereignty of God. Man's sin can never frustrate the will of God, but even man's sin can be used in order to fulfill it. The purpose of God, as expressed to Rebekah in Genesis chapter 25, was perfectly accomplished without one alternation. The sins of Isaac and Esau and Rebekah and Jacob did not in any way thwart God's will from being done. In fact, their sins were employed by God in such a way as to achieve the will of God. God's sovereignty, God's foreknowledge, is never thwarted by man's sin. To the contrary, God is able to achieve his purposes by employing man's sinful acts to work his own plans. This doesn't mean that God makes man sin in order to achieve his purposes, nor is it even to imply that God regards disobedience any less sinful because he turns evil into good. The sins of each party in this chapter are not glossed over or excused. No one can pass the responsibility for their actions onto God. No one can place the burden of guilt on God because of his decree. Sin is due to man's wrong choices. Had all acted in obedience, God would have employed some other means to bring about the blessing of Jacob instead of Esau. God didn't create a situation in which men had to sin in order for his will to be done. Neither will he ever do so. We never have to sin as Christians. God causes all things to work together for good. He doesn't create evil in order to bring about good results. We're responsible for our sins, not God. He allows it, he uses it, but he doesn't necessitate it. Second, we'll learn about the doctrine of sin. Sin always produces separation. It separates men from God and men from God. Men from men and men from God. Third, man's sinfulness is manifested in a distortion that brings into every area of his life: his intellect, his emotions, and his will. The empirical method is a good one, but our selfishness has touched our intellect in such a way as to twist our thinking so we can take the right facts and turn them into wrong conclusions. The empirical method, when employed by sinful men, will often lead them astray. Only when our true motivation is to learn the will of God and to do it. Only when our minds are transformed by the Spirit of God through the Word of God can we expect to rightly interpret the facts before us. From Genesis 27 we are introduced to a strange truth we may not have realized. It is possible to practice faith in a way that is inconsistent with faith. Generally we'd all suppose that actions based upon faith are righteous, while those things which are done apart from faith are evil. There's certainly an element of truth here. But we read in the book of Hebrews concerning the blessings of Jacob and Esau by Isaac. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. Would it ever occur to you that Isaac's blessing of Jacob and Esau was an act of faith? In what sense can this be true? Surely the deception and disobedience of Isaac is not being called righteous by the writer of Hebrews. How can these events in Genesis 27 in any sense be acts of faith on the part of Isaac? To understand the answer to this question, look for a moment at what is found just a few verses later in Hebrews 11. By faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after he had welcomed the spies in peace. Rahab, as we know, lied about the two spies. She did this believing that God was with them and with the nation Israel. She knew that God would prosper his people and destroy those who were his enemies. In this sense, she had faith in the God of Israel and was saved from destruction. Her act of lying was not commended by God, nor should it be seen as anything less than sin. Yet, it stemmed from her faith. Her faith in God was manifested to some degree in her deception. The same can be said for Isaac. Isaac believed in God. He believed in the covenant promises of God. He believed that the one upon whom the blessing was pronounced would be blessed indeed. He believed this so confidently, he was willing to deceive and even disobey to have those benefits fall upon his favorite son Esau. In this sense, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in faith. He pronounced the blessing in the faith that God would honor it and that its recipient would be blessed. Isaac's actions stemmed from faith, but at the same time they were not appropriate to that faith. I believe the same thing is possible and probably all too common for Christians today. Our faith in God may lead us to witness, but we may use methods which are inconsistent with the gospel we proclaim. Our faith may cause us to share the way of salvation, but we may corrupt that gospel in order to cause no offense to the lost. Esau hated Jacob and planned to kill him as soon as Isaac died. Rebekah wanted Jacob to flee to Haran to her brother Laban. She convinced Isaac to send Jacob back to Mesopotamia to find a wife. God has a way of shaping the lives of his children even before they've entered into a relationship with him. We need to look at the life of Jacob in a similar way. In Genesis 27, Jacob referred to the God of Abraham and of Isaac as your God. It is here in chapter 28 that Jacob states, the Lord will be my God. Jacob appears to be on the road to Haran, much as Saul on his way to Damascus, religious but not related to God by personal faith and commitment. Both Saul and Jacob were stopped short by a vision which was to change the course of their lives. While the consequences for failure to pull off the deception of Isaac had been carefully considered, neither Rebekah nor Jacob had weighed the cost of success. Isaac had been deceived and mocked due to the frailties of his age. Esau was deeply resentful, looking forward to a time when he could kill his brother. Rebekah must have found the gap between herself and her husband, not to mention Esau, widened by her deception of her mate. More than this, Rebekah now saw that Jacob would have to leave until emotions cooled, although she had no conception of how long this separation must last. In Genesis 27:42-45, Rebekah began to expedite the plan which she had already formulated in her mind. She must see to it that Jacob escaped the passions of Esau. She would arrange for him to spend time with her brother Laban far from Esau, and so she began to pave the way for Jacob's escape. First, she prepared Jacob for his departure by explaining the need for it in 27:42. Just a few days, she reasoned, would be needed for things to settle down. Verse 44. Instead, it was 20 years before Jacob would return, and that appears was after she died. It's possible Rebekah did realize that Jacob's separation would be long-term. Perhaps she then making his exit more bearable by saying it's only going to be for a few days. Surely it would take more than this to travel that distance and return. The final verse of chapter 27 describes a skillful manipulation of Isaac by Rebekah, leading him to the inevitable conclusion that Jacob should be sent away to Haran, the city of her brother Laban. Rebekah said to Isaac, I'm tired of living because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife from the daughters of Heth like these from your daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? How different was Rebekah's approach from what Sarah could have been predicted to do. We can imagine Sarah would have given Abraham an ultimatum: send my son to my brother Laban in Haran, or else. This she would have demanded all the time, poking a bony finger in the face of Abraham. Rebekah believed in a subtle but sure approach. She never told Isaac what to do. She just spelled out things in such a way that Isaac would reasonably do nothing else. Rebekah let it be known how distressed she was over the Canaanite women whom Esau had taken as wives. Then she insinuated that if Jacob did the same, she wouldn't be fit to live with. Little wonder then that Isaac did what is recorded in the first 2 verses of chapter 28. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Paddan-aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father. From there take yourself a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. This is what you should do. Flee to your uncle Laban in Haran. Stay there with him until your brother's fury is spent. When he forgets what you've done, I will send for you. Why should I lose both of you in one day? Esau saw that Isaac didn't want Jacob to take a wife from Canaan. In rebellion, Esau went and married Manahathel, the daughter of Ishmael. Thus, Esau had at least 3 wives. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan-aram to take himself a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he charged him, saying, You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother, and had gone to Paddan-aram. So Esau saw the daughters of Canaan displease his father Isaac, and Esau went to Ishmael and married, besides the wives that he had, Mahthahal, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebaioth. We therefore conclude that neither Jacob nor Esau had never previously been taught that marriage to a Canaanite woman would be inconsistent with the will of God and unsatisfactory to their parents. Two things are striking about this word of instruction from the lips of Isaac. First, it is unprecedented. Nowhere previously had this instruction been given. We see this from Esau's response to the events of the early chapters in chapter 28. Second, this command to Jacob was untimely. We must admit Jacob going to Paddan-aram to seek a wife is a good one for this instruction, but we mustn't overlook how late in the life of these two sons this is. We previously stated Jacob was 77 years old when he went down to Haran. This would mean Jacob didn't marry until he was 84, since he had to work 7 years for his wife. We must remember Isaac was 40 when he married Rebekah, Esau when he took his two Hittite wives. For Esau, this instruction came 37 years late. Imagine his frustration at finally learning the reason for his parents' grief about his marriage. Surely Isaac's words in 28:1 are too little and too late for Esau, and none too soon for Jacob. Coupled with the fact that marriage was a secondary reason for Jacob's departure to Haran, while survival was primary, we begin to grasp the casual attitude of Isaac towards spiritual training of his sons. To Isaac, these matters must have been of minimal importance to come as little as late as they did. The blessing of Jacob is somewhat more positive. While Isaac had blessed Jacob in the previous chapter, he had done so as though it were Esau. That blessing doesn't reach the clarity and the particularity of 28:3-4. And may God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he also give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your descendants with you, that you may possess the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham. Only by allusion did Isaac convey the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob in Genesis 27. Here in Genesis 28 it's stated in very specific terms. Isaac has finally resigned himself to the fact that God is going to bless Jacob, not Esau. His words reflect this acceptance of things as they must be and as God said they would be. Film and television have conditioned us to delight in destruction of the villain. He gets his just desserts, and usually in a way that benefits his dastardly deeds, or befits his dastardly deeds. We all know that the good guy will win, or at least this used to be true. We must watch until we have had the pleasure of seeing the bad guy get what is coming to him. Likewise, when we come to these verses concerning the response of Esau to what was happening between Isaac and Jacob, we tend to think of Esau as the villain. We expect him to see his downfall, and we plan to enjoy it when it comes. If you've got anything out of this chapter, please feel free to come back and join us again. Every blessing.